So, you've cracked your iPhone 5S screen. What do? Well, this is how you replace your iPhone 5S screen. So you can go from this to this. The procedure for replacing the display on the iPhone 5S is very similar to that of the first generation iPhone SE. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it's virtually identical. So if you've got one of those and its screen is cracked, you can follow along with the same tutorial. So, join me as we switch out this cracked display for a brand new one. To begin, you're going to want to make sure that your iPhone is powered off. So I'll get to that right now. It's very important to power off your iPhone before you begin any sort of repair to prevent shorting any components on the board while it's live. Once your iPhone's powered off, you can move on to removing the two pentalobe screws at the bottom. Now you want to be very careful with these as they're pretty tiny and they can strip easily if you're not careful. In the event that they do strip, some people have had success removing them with a rubber band, so that's always worth a shot. If not, you could try maybe glue of some sort, but you gotta be very careful with that because you don't want to accidentally glue the screw in place. So, once we've got those two screws removed, we can make our way to removing the display itself. Now, if it's really cracked towards the bottom, you may want to put a piece of packing tape over that so that you can get better grip with the suction cup. Now I'm quite lucky where I don't have too many cracks down there, so I may be able to remove this without using packing tape or anything like that. So I'm just going to try with the suction cup. Just place it above the home button. Make sure you've got a good grip, and then you can start to pull up. Now you want to be very careful on the 5S and SE because the Touch ID cable for the home button is connected at the bottom of the phone. So if you pull open too quickly, you risk tearing it, which would prevent you from ever having functioning Touch ID again because this component is paired to the specific device, unfortunately. So it's irreplaceable unless you go through Apple. To begin, we'll just apply a bit of pressure, and you can see it is a bit difficult with the cracks. So if you're struggling with that, I do recommend using a bit of packing tape so that you can have a proper surface to remove the display from. And you'll grab a plastic pry tool. Actually, I'm going to grab some tape because mine's not adhering quite well enough. Be right back. And I'm back with the tape, so you're just going to pull out a tiny strip that's big enough for your suction cup to grab onto, but not large enough where it goes over the side of the phone. That could make it quite difficult to remove the display if it's actively holding it down. So once you've got your piece of packing tape installed, place the suction cup over top of it, and that will create a good seal. And you can begin lifting up on the display and get your plastic pry tool in between the gap and work it around the edge. Now it's important to use a plastic pry tool to open a device because it will prevent damaging the frame or any cables under it. Now you don't want to pry open right away because of the Touch ID cable that I mentioned earlier, and you could risk damaging that. Also, towards the top right of this iPhone, there are the display cables, and if you tear those, well, okay. If your display is cracked, they don't matter too much, but if your display doesn't come with a new earpiece sensor or camera installed, that could damage them. Next, once you've got the display released from the clips on the side, you'll need to release it from the clips on the top. Now, unfortunately, this phone's frame is bent, which will make it a bit challenging to remove this display and install the new one. I'm going to look into reforming that. There are a bunch of different ways to reform it. The best way would be with the specialized corner tool. So we'll just remove the top like that. And we can see that's quite good now. Next step, we're going to disconnect the little Touch ID cable. Now that's in there, and you can see that's the cable right about there, and there's a little cowling that covers it right about here. It's the one with the two circles on top of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pair of tweezers and pay close attention to grab the cowling and not the cable. And you're going to pull up at the end of it. Now that's released it, and the cable has come with it. Yeah, it was just kind of stuck to it. we can just put that off to the side and don't lose track of that because it's very important to keep the cable connected. Otherwise it could come disconnected while in use, which wouldn't be great. Now we can move on into the phone a bit further. And the first step that you want to take when you get into the phone and have proper access to it, oh yeah, don't open the display too far because you could risk tearing the cable. So just open it about that much at most. And then you're going to take your Phillips 00 screwdriver and unscrew the 2 screws covering this little bracket here. Now this covers the dock connector to the board and the battery connector to the board. So what you'll do is just remove the little silver bracket, and now you're going to use your fingernail or a little plastic pry tool. I always use my fingernail, it works best for me, but just pry up on the battery connector, disconnect it, and now there's no power to the board, which means you are not at risk of shorting anything. Now with that out of the way, we can move our way up to the top part, and we can see there's this little cover here. Now there are 4 screws on it, and the one on the top right is not magnetized. That's because if it was, it would interfere with the antennas. So you've got to be pretty careful with that so that you don't lose it or misplace it. Another thing with these is they are different lengths, so you want to make sure that you reinstall the proper length screw into the hole, into its corresponding hole. Otherwise you could risk permanently damaging your board, which is not a fun time. Oh, that's weird. Huh. That one should not be magnetized. I guess this one may have been serviced already. But for the most part, those screws are not magnetized. If I find one that isn't magnetized, I'll know that this phone has been serviced by someone other than me. But especially these 2 screws down here, they are board mounted screws. So if you put a screw that's too big into one of those holes, you could permanently damage the board. I've seen this happen on a few 5S's where the screen appears to work at first after it is damaged, but then it eventually starts to boot loop and it goes to a red screen with weird artifacts on the display. It's not a good time. So once you've got that little bracket removed, you can start to pry up on these 3 cables here. So there's the display, the digitizer, and the front-facing camera and sensors. So just pry up on those with your fingernail or a plastic pry tool, and you can remove the display from the phone. Now we can bring in the new display. This one already has all the sensors and stuff installed, so I don't need to transfer them over, except for the Touch ID button, which we'll move on over. If your new display does not have the back shield and all the sensors pre-installed, then you'll need to transfer those over, and it's pretty simple. There are a couple of screws on each side of the frame, and then a few more up there holding the sensor in place. You just unscrew those and transfer everything over to the new display. You want to make sure that you put each screw back in its corresponding hole to prevent any sort of damage, and we'll make our way over to the Touch ID sensor. So this is where you've got to be pretty careful. The Touch ID sensor, as I mentioned earlier, is not replaceable. You can replace it with another one and it will work as a button, but Touch ID will not work. So you've got to pay extra close attention. Now, just here on the Touch ID cable, there's this little grounding clip. You want to make sure that that goes under the cable and into this screw hole. No, it doesn't go into the screw hole. The screw screws through it into the hole. And then we have got 2 screws holding the little back bracket for Touch ID. There's one on the right and one on the left. And we can just remove that little bracket. And now we move down to the Touch ID sensors. So you're just going to be very careful and push it a bit from the front so that you can get that to come out a bit. And you want to be careful not to accidentally tear that cable. So push at it so that it comes out on this side without the cable first. There we go. And now we can work our way onto the side with the cable. Now this cable can be a bit tricky to remove at times. Heat can work quite nicely to remove it. There are some little aligning kind of holes in the cable, so you can get your tool under that and start prying up to free the cable. And your Touch ID button should be free now. We want to take a look on the other side and make sure it's clean. So this one's one of the cleaner ones I've seen, to be completely honest. And what I'm going to do is just remove whatever leftover dust there is on this button. So I'll be right back. So I have a paper towel to kind of scrape it onto so it's not all over my workspace. If you're putting a paper towel down, you want to make sure that you check that all your screws are where they should be if you're putting over them like I am, but I don't recommend that. I'm just doing that because I'm short for space. So what you can do to clean your Touch ID button, run a set of tweezers around the edge and be very careful of the cable. This will remove any sort of dirt and help it click better. I am gonna speed up this part of the footage because it's probably boring to watch someone clean a Touch ID sensor. Once you've got all the dirt removed, you can install it like that, but I'm just going to give it a final once over with a cotton swab and some isopropyl alcohol. I'll just give it a gentle wipe with some isopropyl alcohol, and you want to be careful not to get the adhesive on it, otherwise you'll need to replace that to make sure that the button doesn't rotate in its place and tear the cable. With all that out of the way, we can reinstall the Touch ID sensor into the frame of the display. So I'll just get that out of the way and make sure that we still have all the screws that I removed from under it. I do, so I will now throw out that paper towel. Now we can reinstall the Touch ID sensor, and it goes with the extra part of the cable to the right, and we'll just align that into the new display. And install the little extra board. And now once that's in place, you can go around the edge with a black stick and just gently push down on the adhesive so that it's making good contact with the bezel so that the button will stay in place. There we go. Now we can reinstall this little bracket. And it's 2 screws, and it goes with the little angled tapered bit to the right. Now that that's all in, you can give it a test, and that's clicking quite nicely. So we can move on back to the back side and make sure that we reinstall this little part right here with the screw. Now sometimes the screw stays in place. I'm quite lucky because it did this time. Others, it may just unscrew all the way, but just make sure that you put the little grounding clip under the cable and with the little clip part sticking out to the right on top of the display frame. Now don't over tighten this screw because it is directly making contact with the cable. With all that in place, we can move on over to the frame and get the display reinstalled. Now this frame, unfortunately, is a bit bent, so I'm going to take a look and see what I can do to reform that before we continue. And I'm back. I also took the opportunity to clean the edge of the phone to make sure that it was nice and clean. That way we don't have to worry about any sort of dirt in there. Now that we've transferred the home button and cleaned everything up, we can finally reassemble the 2 halves of the phone back into one. So we'll begin with the display, and we'll start with this tiny cable under all the others. And just click the other ones into place afterwards. This is normally a lot easier without a camera in the way. So give it some patience. It still can be a bit tricky. These are tiny connectors. So once we've got that in place, we'll move on to the shield for the display brackets, for the display connectors. And you want to pay attention to put every screw back in the hole that it came from. The two bottom screws are going directly onto the board, so if you accidentally put the wrong screw on there, it could potentially damage the board. In fact, you're extremely likely to damage the board. And you don't want to over tighten any of these screws. Do it so that it's just a bit past finger tight. If you feel any sort of resistance with any screw, stop. You could be cross-threading it, or it could be the wrong screw. If you're ever unsure about which screw goes where, iFixit's repair guides, they have the screw measurements, and if you've got a set of calipers, you can actually measure each individual screw to make sure it's going back in the proper hole. So now we can reconnect the battery and we can move on to the last shield. Interestingly, the battery is not the last thing in the 5S to be connected. Normally you should connect the battery last because then you'll prevent the board from being live, but due to the way Touch ID needs to be connected, the battery is the second last thing to be connected in the 5S. Again, be careful with the screws to not over tighten them or cross thread them. And now we can move on to the Touch ID sensor. Now this one can be a bit tricky. You want to kind of close the phone like that and then position the Touch ID sensor cable just on top of its little connector down there. Once you've got that in place, you can use a black stick and position it on top. Get it to make a nice connection in there. Then you can use your tweezers and align this little clip that goes on top, the Touch ID cowling. Let's get that in focus. And you can see there's a little clip in the middle here on this side, and that one goes towards the bottom of the iPhone. So we'll just grab it from the side like that. You're going to carefully install the cowling. And it goes in with the end towards the top of the phone first. This can be a bit finicky, but give it some patience and you'll get it in place. Now we can power on the phone to test it out, and that's already a good sign. If there are any lines going down your screen, it could be a cable that's not seated properly, so you can just open up the phone, disconnect the cables, reconnect them, try it out again, and see if the lines, the vertical lines, are still appearing on the phone. That often will fix the issue. If it doesn't, then you might have a bad display, but there we go. We can see it's responding to touch. And we'll test out the front camera. But yeah, there's the rear camera and the front camera. Let's try that out. Look, it's my ceiling. How exciting. And the home button's working, and we'll try out Touch ID just to make sure. That's a good sign. So we've got Touch ID still working. So that leaves us with one final step. Two, technically, because you gotta screw everything into place. But we'll finish by closing up the iPhone. So what you need to do is put it in at a bit of an angle. So the display clips under the top part of the phone, and then you can kind of clip it into place along the edges, working your way down to the bottom of the phone. Just like that. So with everything in place, we can put the final two pentalobe screws into the bottom of the iPhone and get everything sealed up. And with these, again, be careful, they will strip easily. You just want to put them in so that they're about finger tight and flush with the bottom of the phone. And there we have it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you out. If it did, maybe feel free to leave a like, maybe comment, and even subscribe to the video. And if you want to see more from me, I have linked my Twitter in the description below. Thanks for watching, and have a great day. So you can go from this, and then that's where I put into this. So don't forget that at the end, William. To this. There, that's the end part of the first part of the video, so I'll include that. This procedure should... Adjusting the tripod, ooh, that's fun, isn't it? But I'm just gonna get a drink of water, because I am parched. That'll help. In the event they do strip, some people have had success. In the event that they do strip, some people have success. In the event that they do strip, some people have had success with a rubber band. Okay, let's try that. In the event that they do strip, some people have... Why can't I say that?